Memory, I've learned, is not a film. It doesn't play back in perfect chronological order. It's more like a shattered mirror, offering sharp, brilliant fragments of a whole you can never quite piece back together. My earliest fragments are all of the dusk. They are painted in the bruised colors of a dying sun, the deep violet, the blood orange, the final, sickly yellow that clung to the horizon like a stain. This was not a time of peace in our home. It was a countdown. I was 7 years old, and I was a student of the light. I knew its phases better than any book. I knew the way the afternoon sun would stretch long, golden fingers across the wooden floorboards of our isolated house. I knew how it would climb the walls inch by inch, until it pooled on the ceiling in a warm, lazy sea. And I knew, with an instinct buried deeper than bone, the exact moment that warmth would begin to curdle. The change was subtle at first. The quality of the light would thin, losing its heat, its substance. This was the signal. Without a word, the ritual would begin. My mother, a woman whose face I remember more as a collection of worried expressions than a set of features, would move to the windows. They were tall, panoramic windows, a cruel architectural choice for a family like ours. She would draw the curtains not with a gentle pull, but with a series of sharp, violent yanks, as if tearing a bandage from a wound. The thick velvet fabric was the color of dried blood, and when it fell into place, it swallowed the light whole, muffling the world outside. The sudden dimness in the room was a physical blow, a pressure change in the air. While she secured the windows, my father would begin his patrol. He was a tall, silent man who walked the house with the grim purpose of a watchman on a prison wall. His steps were a familiar, heavy rhythm on the groaning floorboards. He would start in the basement and work his way up. Every light switch was checked, not just flipped off, but physically inspected. He would press his thumb against the plastic toggle, ensuring it was firmly in the down position. Lamps weren't just switched off. They were unplugged from the wall, the prongs pulled from the socket with a stiff, final tug. He moved with a frantic efficiency that betrayed the calmness he tried to project. His jaw was always tight, a knot of muscle twitching just below his ear. My job was the small things. The nightlight in the hallway, a pale plastic moon that was never allowed to shine. The digital clock on the microwave, whose glowing green numbers had been covered with a thick strip of black electrical tape years ago. I would go to our small collection of battery-powered toys, a sputtering robot and a toy car with headlights, and meticulously remove the double A's, placing them in a small wooden box. It was a game I had to win every single night. We all had to win. We didn't speak during the ritual. The only sounds were the thud of my father's boots, the rasp of the curtains, and my own shallow breaths. The air grew thick with a silent, shared understanding. The light was a traitor. It was a beacon for things that lived in the spaces between the trees, things that waited for the world to turn its back. By the time my father had completed his sweep, the last of the sun's glow would be a faint, apologetic line under the heavy drapes. We would convene in the living room, the heart of the house, and wait for the final step. He would walk to the main fuse box, a heavy metal door set into the wall near the kitchen. He would open it and with a grunt of effort pull the main breaker. The ensuing silence was absolute. It was a deafness that went beyond the absence of noise. The hum of the refrigerator, a sound so constant I only ever noticed it when it was gone, vanished. The faint buzz of electricity in the walls, the phantom lifeblood of a modern home, ceased. The house died, and in its death it became our sanctuary. We would sit together on the sofa, a small island in a vast, dark ocean. My mother's hand would find mine, her fingers cold but her grip firm. My father would stand by the curtained window, peering through a tiny crack he allowed himself, his silhouette a stoic statue against the deep, final purple of the world outside. It was in this profound, intentional darkness that I first learned the true nature of fear. It wasn't the boogeyman in the closet, or the monster under the bed. It was a patient, watchful presence. On a normal night, the world outside our home would be alive with the chirping of crickets, the croaking of frogs, the rustle of unseen creatures in the undergrowth. But on our land, the moment the sun disappeared completely, so did the noise. Everything fell silent, as if holding its breath, as if it too was listening, waiting, hiding from the same thing we were, and we would sit there, For hours, a silent family in a dead house, listening to the nothingness outside and praying it wouldn't notice we were there. To live in darkness is to learn a new language. Your eyes, rendered useless, become dormant senses. Your ears, your skin, the soles of your feet, they awaken. Our house, after the ritual, was a symphony of subtleties that only the initiated could understand. I learned the groan of the third step on the staircase that meant my father was coming up to my room. I knew the specific sigh the floorboards in the hall made under my mother's lighter weight. I could navigate the entire house by touch, my small hands trailing along the cool plaster of the walls, the grain of the wood familiar as a lover's face. This was our normal. We ate our evening meals in near silence, the scraping of forks on ceramic plates amplified into thunderous events. We didn't dare use candles. My mother would prepare everything before sunset. A cold supper laid out on the kitchen table. We would find our plates by memory. Sometimes in the pitch black, my hand would brush against my father's, and he would flinch with a sharp intake of breath, the ever-present tension vibrating through him. It was during these long, silent hours that I began to learn the other language, the one that came from outside. At first, it was dismissible, easily explained away by a child's overactive imagination or a parent's placating lie. There was the scratching, a dry, skittering sound that would travel along the western wall of the house. "It's just the branch of the old oak, Leo," my father would murmur, his voice a low rumble in the darkness. "The wind is making it scrape against the siding." But I had climbed that oak tree. I knew its branches. The closest one was a good 10 feet from the house. It would take a hurricane to make it reach. The wind on most nights was just a gentle breeze. The lie was thin, and it was the first time I realized my parents were crafting a separate, safer reality for me, one I was beginning to see the seams of. Then came the whispers. It was almost always the wind, I told myself. The way it would press against the eaves of the house, forcing its way through unseen cracks. But it didn't just howl. It cohered. It would rise and fall with the cadence of speech. In the dead of night, lying on my bed with my eyes wide open, staring at a ceiling I couldn't see, I would hear it. A long, drawn-out hiss sound like a secret being told just outside my window. Sometimes it almost sounded like my name. Leo. When I told my mother, she held me, her body rigid. The wind plays tricks, my love. The house is old. It makes strange sounds. Her explanation was a shield. But her trembling hands told me she heard it too. The true turning point, the moment my childish acceptance curdled into active dread, came on a moonless autumn night. The darkness outside was absolute, a thick, ink-black nothing that seemed to press against the windows. The scratching started, but it was different this time. It wasn't on the siding. It was a sharp, rhythmic tap-tap-tapping directly on the glass of the living room window. My father froze, a half-eaten sandwich in his hand. My mother let out a tiny, choked gasp. I could hear it in the darkness, a small, wet sound of pure terror. Tap, tap, tap. It was slow, deliberate. Too rhythmic for a bird, too high off the ground for a fox or a raccoon. It was the sound of a fingernail on a pane of glass. My father stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. He didn't go to the window. Instead, he walked to the center of the room, positioning himself between us and the sound. He stood there for what felt like an eternity, a sentinel in the dark listening. The tapping continued for another minute, a patient, curious sound before it stopped as abruptly as it began. No one spoke. We didn't finish our meal. My mother eventually took my hand and led me upstairs to my room. Her grip was so tight it hurt. She tucked me into bed, the covers pulled up to my chin, and whispered, "Go to sleep, Leo." But her voice was thin and brittle, and I knew she wouldn't be sleeping. None of us would. Later that night, I overheard them. The walls were thin, and their whispered, frantic voices carried from their bedroom down the hall. They must have thought I was asleep, closer to night, my mother hissed, her voice sharp with panic. It was at the window. It's never been at the window. I know, my father's voice was a strained rasp. It's testing. It's always testing. What does it want, John? After all this time, it wants what it has always wanted. To be seen, to be let in. We just have to keep... His voice trailed off, but I could fill in the blanks. We just have to keep pretending. We just have to keep hiding. I lay in my bed, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. a tree branch, the wind. Old lies I could no longer use to comfort myself. There was something outside, something intelligent and patient, and it knew we were in here. Lying in the dark, listening to the silence that followed their hushed argument, I felt a profound and chilling certainty wash over me. The house wasn't our sanctuary, it was a cage, and the thing tapping on the glass was our warden. My 8th birthday was marked by the rarest of events, a visitor. My mother's sister, Carol, lived 3 states away in a city that, to my young mind, might as well have been another planet. She was a whirlwind of bright colors and loud laughter, a creature from a world that had never learned to fear the sunset. Her visit was a carefully negotiated affair, a single, sun-drenched afternoon that felt both like a blessing and a ticking time bomb. She arrived just after noon, her car a cherry red slash against the dull green and brown of our long, unpaved driveway. She hugged me so hard I thought my ribs would crack, and she smelled of perfume and hairspray, alien scents in our world of damp earth and dust. For my parents, her presence triggered a quiet, frantic energy. My mother's smile was a thin, brittle thing, stretched tight across her face. My father, usually a statue of silent vigilance, paced the perimeter of the living room, his eyes constantly flicking to the sun's position in the sky. Aunt Carol was blissfully, painfully oblivious. She talked about her job, her friends, the dazzling lights of her city. Every mention of a movie theater, a street lamp, or a neon sign was a small, sharp stab in the thick atmosphere of our home. We ate cake in the bright afternoon light, a celebration so jarringly normal it felt like a dream. But the entire time I could feel the countdown. Each tick of the grandfather clock in the hall was a beat closer to the ritual. Around 4 o'clock, with the afternoon sun beginning its slow golden descent, Aunt Carol clapped her hands together. "Oh, I almost forgot. Presents." My father's jaw tightened. "Carol, you really didn't have to." "Nonsense," she chirped, retrieving a brightly wrapped box from her bag. I tore the paper away to reveal a simple, wonderful gift. It was a small, clear plastic jar filled with dozens of pale, greenish-white plastic shapes. Stars, moons, and spiraling galaxies. A leaflet inside showed them arranged on a dark ceiling, glowing with a soft, ethereal light. Glow-in-the-dark stars. My heart gave a little leap of pure, childish joy. And then I saw my parents' faces. It was a look I had never seen before. It wasn't anger. It was a raw, naked terror. The same look they had on the worst nights, when the sounds from outside were louder and more insistent. My mother's hand flew to her mouth, and a tiny, strangled noise escaped her throat. My father took a half-step forward, his hands clenched into fists. "What is it?" Aunt Carol asked, her cheerful demeanor finally faltering. "He likes space, right? I remember you said—" "He can't have it," my father said. His voice was flat, devoid of emotion, which was somehow more frightening than if he had yelled. "What? Why, it's just a toy." My mother found her voice a strained, unconvincing whisper. He's afraid of the dark, Carol. We don't use lights in his room. It helps him sleep." The irony was so thick it was almost comical. My aunt looked from my mother's pale, terrified face to my father's rigid stance, and then to me, a child who had been raised in the very belly of the dark. Confusion warred with hurt on her face. "Oh," she said softly. "Well, it's not really a light. It's just a little glow, a comfort." She pushed the jar gently into my hands. "Every boy deserves to have some stars, don't you think?" My parents were trapped. To insist further would be to crack open the door to a truth no sane person would ever believe. To refuse the gift with the vehemence they so clearly felt would shatter the fragile illusion of normalcy they tried to maintain for this one afternoon. My father's jaw worked silently. After a long, agonizing moment, he gave a curt, almost imperceptible nod. The unspoken condition hung in the air. The gift was allowed, but it would never be used. The rest of the visit was a rushed, awkward affair. My father all but pushed my aunt out the door an hour later, while the sun was still a safe distance from the horizon. "Long drive back," he'd said, his hand firmly on her back. "Don't want you driving in the dark." I watched her red car disappear down the driveway, a final speck of the bright, normal world vanishing from sight. Then the door closed, the bolt slid home, and the ritual began. That night, the house felt darker than ever. The silence was heavier. The memory of my aunt's laughter and the scent of her perfume felt like ghosts from another life. I was tucked into bed, the jar of stars clutched under my blanket. It felt cool and smooth against my skin. It was contraband. It was a promise. It was a tiny piece of a world where people weren't afraid of the light. Lying there, in the oppressive, familiar blackness, a new feeling began to sprout in my chest. It was a small hot seed of defiance. My parents' fear was a cage, and for the first time I saw a key. They weren't just protecting me from the things outside. They were keeping me from the world, from the light, from a life where a child could have stars on his ceiling. The sounds began outside, the familiar scratches, the sibilant whisper of the wind. But tonight I wasn't just afraid, I was angry. I slid out of bed, the cold floorboards shocking my bare feet. With the silent, practiced movements of a creature born to the dark, I made my way to my desk. I took out the stars, one by one, their pale plastic forms almost invisible. I couldn't see them, but I could feel them. They were small and sharp, like tiny, stolen bits of daylight, and I began to stick them to the ceiling one by one, creating a secret, silent galaxy that was waiting, just waiting for its first nightfall to be born. Sleep did not come. I lay in my bed, a coiled spring of anticipation and fear, my eyes fixed on the black canopy of my ceiling. For an hour, nothing happened. The darkness in my room remained absolute, and a childish wave of disappointment washed over me. Perhaps the stars were duds, their promised magic nothing more than a cheap marketing ploy. The familiar night sounds started up outside, the distant scratching, the whispering wind, and I began to relax into the grim reality I had always known. And then I saw it. It began not as a light, but as a change in the quality of the blackness above me. A faint, ghostly impression, like an afterimage burned onto my retinas. I blinked and the impression remained, slowly, painstakingly. As my eyes adjusted to a new, impossible spectrum, the stars began to emerge. A soft, milky green glow, so faint it was barely there at all. But it was there. My tiny, defiant galaxy pulsed with a silent, secret light. There was Orion, just as the paper chart had shown. There was the swirling arm of a nebula, and a smattering of tiny, individual stars I had placed at random. A profound, triumphant joy surged through my small body. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. In a world that had been leached of all color and light every night of my life, I had created my own cosmos. I had hung the stars myself. I lay there for a long time, mesmerized, a silent god in my own miniature universe. The glow was soft, comforting. It pushed back the oppressive, suffocating darkness and carved out a small pocket of wonder just for me. For the first time I could remember, I wasn't afraid in my own room. That was when the sounds outside stopped. It wasn't a gradual fading. It was a sudden, universal halt. The scratching ceased mid-scratch. The wind died as if a giant hand had cupped the house, shielding it from the world. The silence that fell was different from the silence of the ritual. That was a dead, empty silence. This was a living one. It was heavy, pregnant, the silence of a predator that has just caught the scent of its prey. A cold dread, sharp and familiar, snaked its way up my spine, extinguishing the warm joy of moments before. I was no longer a god in my universe. I was a boy in a small room, and I had just lit a candle in the middle of a wolf-infested forest. My window was on the second floor. I had always taken a strange comfort in that fact. The scratching, the tapping, it was always downstairs. Whatever was out there was bound to the earth. But the feeling that washed over me now was not coming from downstairs. It was a focused, intense pressure directed at my room. The air grew cold, and I could feel a static prickle on my skin. I was being watched. I turned my head, a slow, creaking movement that felt deafeningly loud. I looked towards the window. It was a large, single pane of glass, and tonight, with no moon, it was just a black, featureless square. For a moment, I saw only the faint, greenish reflection of my stars, a ghostly echo of my creation. Then, a shape blotted them out. It rose from the bottom of the frame, a slow, fluid movement. It was a silhouette, humanoid but wrong in every proportion. It was impossibly tall and slender, its shoulders too narrow for its height, its limbs too long, like a tree branch that had grown in the shape of a man. But the most terrifying thing about it was its color. It was not a shadow. It was a void. It was a patch of night that was somehow darker, deeper than the surrounding blackness. A hole in the world that drank the faint starlight and gave nothing back. Its head, a smooth, featureless oval, tilted upwards. My blood ran cold as I realized it wasn't looking at me. It was looking past me, up at the ceiling. It was captivated by my stars. It was watching my stolen galaxy glow with a quiet, unnerving intensity. It had been drawn here by my tiny, foolish act of rebellion. This creature, this piece of mobile midnight, had climbed the wall of my house, drawn by a light no brighter than a firefly. We stayed like that for an eternity, the two of us, me frozen in my bed, a silent scream trapped in my throat. It, a motionless spectator at my window, its attention fixed on the glowing plastic on my ceiling. Then one of its unnaturally long arms lifted, a finger thin and sharp as a shard of obsidian, extended until the tip touched the glass of the window pane. Tap. The sound was tiny, almost delicate. It was not the angry, violent banging I had heard downstairs. It was quiet, curious, a sound of discovery. It was the softest sound I had ever heard, and it shattered my world completely. It was an acknowledgement. I see your light, I am here. The silhouette slid away, sinking below the window frame as fluidly as it had risen. And I was alone again, but the room was not the same. The silence it left behind was a ringing, screaming thing. My stolen stars, which had been a source of wonder and pride only minutes before, now pulsed with a sickly green light. Each one an eye, a beacon, a betrayal. I had not created a galaxy. I had painted a target on my own ceiling. I did not sleep. I lay rigid in my bed, my gaze fixed on the mocking glow above, convinced that at any moment the tapping would start again, or that the window latch would click open. Every creak of the old house was the sound of a slender footstep on the stairs. Every whisper of the wind was my name being called. The fear was a physical presence, a heavy weight pressing down on my chest, making each breath a shallow, desperate gasp. The sunrise, when it finally came, felt less like a rescue and more like the arrival of a warden to inspect the damage. The following day was a study in silence. The air in the house was thick with unspoken anxieties. My parents moved like ghosts, their faces pale and drawn. They had heard nothing, seen nothing of my specific transgression, but they could sense the shift. The atmosphere of the night, the profound, predatory stillness that had followed the stopping of the wind, had left its mark on them as well. They knew something had been different. Something had been closer. I moved through the hours in a fog of guilt and terror. I couldn't meet their eyes. Every time my father looked at me, I felt certain he could see the reflection of the silhouette in my pupils. I considered telling them, confessing my crime, but the words would not form. How could I explain what I had done? It was a betrayal of the only sacred law I had ever known. The dread grew as the sun began its inevitable descent. The familiar ritual started, but tonight it felt different. It was no longer a routine. It was a desperate, hopeless preparation for a siege I knew was coming. Performed my tasks with trembling hands, removing the batteries from my toys, my heart hammering against my ribs. Tonight the thing would come back to my window. It would tap and my parents would know. The thought was unbearable. My mother drew the curtains. My father began his patrol. The house grew dimmer, the shadows stretching and deepening until they consumed everything. I sat on the edge of my bed, a condemned prisoner awaiting the final verdict. I heard his heavy footsteps on the stairs. Down the hall, they stopped outside my door. The door creaked open and his large frame filled the doorway for a moment before he stepped inside. The room was nearly dark, only a faint bruised twilight bleeding through a small gap in the curtains. He stood for a moment, letting his eyes adjust, and I held my breath. He did his usual checks. He walked to the lamp on my desk, ensuring it was unplugged. He opened my closet, peered into the darkness, and shut it again. He seemed satisfied. He turned to leave, his hand on the doorknob. My heart gave a frantic leap of relief. He hadn't seen, but he paused. Perhaps some paternal instinct, some subtle change in the room's atmosphere, gave him pause. He stood completely still, his back to me, and in that stillness, as his own eyes adjusted fully to the gloom, the stars chose that moment to be born. The glow started, faint at first, a barely perceptible nebula of green. Then it strengthened. A constellation bloomed into existence directly above his head. My father made a sound I will never forget. It was not a word. It was a low, guttural noise from deep in his chest, a strangled sound of agony and disbelief. He tilted his head back, and I could see the faint, ghostly light reflected in his wide, horrified eyes. For a moment, he was paralyzed. Then a terrifying energy seized him. His movements were no longer human. They were frantic, primal. He spun around, his eyes scanning the room for a weapon. He seized the small wooden chair from my desk, hoisting it above his head. He didn't try to scrape the stars off. He attacked them. A wordless roar tore from his throat as he swung the chair up at the ceiling. The sound of splintering wood and cracking plaster was like a gunshot in the silent house. He swung again and again, a wild, desperate frenzy of destruction. He was not just destroying the plastic stars. He was trying to kill the light they emitted, to beat the glow back into submission. My mother must have heard the commotion. She ran into the room, stopping short at the sight. She saw the glowing ceiling, my father's violent assault, and she didn't scream or try to stop him. She simply crumpled, her hands flying to her face as a series of dry, racking sobs shook her entire body. The room was chaos, the air filled with the dust of shattered plaster and the sharp scent of splintered wood. My father raged, a whirlwind of terror and violence, until the last of the glowing specks had been obliterated from the ceiling. He stood there in the now perfect darkness, panting, the broken leg of the chair clutched in his white-knuckled fist. The only sounds were his ragged breaths and my mother's heartbroken sobs. Then he turned, and I felt his burning gaze land on me. He strode across the room, grabbing my upper arm. His grip was like a band of steel. He leaned down, his face close to mine, and even in the darkness I could feel the heat of his terror and fury. "What did you do?" he rasped, his voice a raw, broken thing. He shook me, his control completely gone. "Tell me, Leo, what did you see?" The weeks that followed the shattering were a time of cold, silent penance. My father had repaired the ceiling, his movement stiff and angry, the fresh plaster a stark white scar against the old paint. But the trust between us was a ruin he could not fix. I was watched, always. My parents' eyes would follow me as I moved through the house, their expressions a mixture of fear and accusation. They were no longer just my protectors. They were my wardens. The unspoken question hung in every silent room. "What did you see?" I never answered, and they never asked again. My father's fear manifested in a flurry of grim activity. He hammered thick boards over the small attic window. He replaced the locks on the doors with heavy, formidable deadbolts. He caulked every window frame, sealing even the most microscopic cracks as if trying to make the house airtight, to stop not just a physical intruder, but the whispers that slid through the walls. The house, once a sanctuary, now felt like a tomb. The ritual of Dusk became even more severe, a frantic, desperate ceremony performed with the grim piety of a condemned cult. We had lived this way for another year, a fragile, broken family locked in our self-imposed prison. When the impossible happened, it was a late afternoon in October, the air crisp and the light already beginning to thin. I was in the living room, ostensibly reading a book, but really just watching the slow, inexorable march of the shadows across the floor. That was when we heard it, a sound so alien to our world that for a moment I couldn't place it. It was a coughing, sputtering roar, the sound of a struggling engine, and it was close. My father was on his feet in an instant. My mother rushed in from the kitchen, her face a pale mask of alarm. We crept to the heavy curtains of the front window, my father pulling them back just enough to create a tiny slit to peer through. Down on the dirt track that served as our road, a battered-looking sedan had rolled to a stop, steam plumed from under its hood. After a moment, the driver's door opened and a man emerged. He was dressed in clothes meant for the city, thin-soled shoes and a light jacket, completely inadequate for the encroaching autumn chill. He kicked one of his tires in frustration, then pulled a phone from his pocket. He stared at it, shook it, and held it up to the sky, a futile plea to a non-existent signal. Then he looked around, his gaze sweeping across the dense, silent woods, and he saw our house. It was the only sign of human life for at least 10 miles. A thin curl of smoke rose from our chimney, a relic of the afternoon's fire. a beacon of our existence we could not hide during the day. His face registered a flicker of relief. He started walking towards us. A frantic, whispered argument erupted between my parents. "We have to help him, John," my mother pleaded, her voice a tight, strained thing. "We can't just leave him out there. Not with the sun going down. You know what will happen," she was right. To leave him outside would be to murder him. And what happens if we let him in? My father shot back, his voice a low, vicious rasp. His eyes were fixed on the approaching figure. "He won't understand. He'll want lights, a phone. He'll bring his entire world in here with him. He'll break the rules before he even knows they exist. We can explain. We can try." "Try what, Helen? Tell him we live in the dark because of things in the woods? He'll think we're insane. He'll fight us. One matchstick, one flick of a lighter, and it's all over." The man was getting closer. I could see his face now. He looked tired, annoyed, but not afraid. He was a man from the other world, the bright world, where darkness was simply the absence of light, not a presence in itself. He had no idea he was walking out of a broken-down car and into a cage. He reached the porch. His footsteps were loud and confident on the old wooden planks. He knocked on the door, a sharp, cheerful rat-a-tat-tat that sounded like an explosion in our silent home. We froze. My mother held her breath, her hand covering her mouth. My father stood like a man carved from stone, his face a battleground of indecision and terror. The man knocked again, louder this time. "Hello, anybody home? My car gave out. I'd be mighty grateful if I could just use your phone for a minute." The sun was touching the tops of the trees now. We had maybe 30 minutes. The golden hour was turning to the violet minute. My father looked at my mother, and in his eyes I saw a lifetime of fear warring with a single residual spark of human decency. I saw him weigh the certain damnation of a stranger against the potential damnation of his family. My mother's eyes were wet with tears. "Please, John," she whispered. "Don't let him die." With a shuddering sigh of utter defeat, my father turned. The look on his face was one of a man walking to his own execution. He moved to the door, his hand trembling as he drew back the heavy bolt. He opened it, not wide, but just enough to show his face. The man on the porch smiled, a broad, relieved grin. "Oh, thank God, I thought I was going to be sleeping with the squirrels." "Name's Arthur." My father said nothing, simply opened the door wider. The chapter ends as Arthur steps inside, bringing a gust of cold air and the smell of the world with him. The heavy door swings shut and my father slides the bolt home. The sound echoes through the house like a death sentence. Through the window, I see the last brilliant sliver of the sun disappear behind the distant hills. The ritual is late, and now we are not alone. The moment the bolt slid home, my father lunged for the fuse box. There was no time for the lesser parts of the ritual. No unplugging of lamps, no checking of switches. He yanked the main breaker down with a final, desperate heave. The house died, and we were plunged into a darkness so sudden and complete it was disorienting. A startled curse came from our guest. "Whoa, geez, you guys have a power issue or something?" Arthur's voice was a nervous, booming presence in the blackness. "The wiring is faulty," my mother said immediately, her voice unnaturally high. "It's old, we have to shut it down at night." For safety? For safety?" Arthur's laugh was sharp, incredulous. "Sitting in the pitch-black dark with a stranger in your house is your idea of safety." "It's just for the night," my father's voice rumbled, tight with a command he couldn't enforce. "In the morning I can look at your car." I could hear the shuffling of Arthur's feet, the sound of a man trying to orient himself in a suddenly hostile environment. The air, already thick with our family's unique brand of terror, was now curdling with his suspicion. He was a creature of logic, of cause and effect, and nothing about this situation made sense. He saw deadbolts, heavy curtains, and two adults who were clearly petrified. His conclusion, I realized later, was not supernatural. It was far more practical. He had stumbled into the home of a backwoods cult, or a pair of lunatics, and he was now their prisoner. "Right," Arthur said slowly, his voice losing its neighborly tone and taking on a wary edge. "Look, I appreciate you letting me in, I really do. But I'm not going to just sit here in the dark. That's insane. I've got a flashlight on my phone." I heard the fumbling of his jacket, the faint click of a button. "No!" my father yelled, the word a raw, explosive command. He lunged through the darkness. I heard a scuffle, a grunt from Arthur. "No lights! Get your hands off me!" Arthur shouted, his voice now laced with genuine fear. Not of the dark, but of my father. "What the hell is wrong with you people?" "You don't understand," my mother pleaded, her voice a desperate sob from across the room. "You have to listen to us. Please, just for a few hours. No lights. I'm not playing this game," Arthur snarled. I could hear him backing away, bumping into a small end table. Something rattled. "I'm trapped in here with a couple of crazies. I need to see. I need to see what you're doing." There was another sound, a small, dry, rattling noise. The sound of a small cardboard box being shaken. My blood turned to ice. It was a sound I had never ever heard inside our house at night. "What is that?" my father demanded, his voice dropping to a deadly whisper. "It's called taking back control," Arthur said, his voice trembling with a mixture of fear and defiance. "I'm sorry, but you've left me no choice." My parents both screamed the word at the same time, a symphony of pure, undiluted horror. No, it was too late. A sharp fist cut through the darkness, a sound more violent and intrusive than a gunshot. A tiny, brilliant flower of flame bloomed in the center of the room. For a single, breathtaking second, the world was illuminated. I saw everything. I saw Arthur's face pale with sweat, his eyes wide with defiance. I saw the small, sputtering matchstick held between his trembling fingers. I saw my mother frozen mid-lunge, her face a mask of utter despair. And I saw my father, his arm outstretched, his expression one of a man who has just witnessed the end of the world. The light flickered, casting huge, dancing shadows on the walls, and the house screamed. It was not a sound from a single source. It came from every direction at once. The instant the flame was born, a thunderous boom struck the front door, so powerful it shook the entire house. It wasn't a knock. It was an impact. The sound of a giant, solid object being hurled against the wood. Simultaneously, a spiderweb of cracks erupted across the large living room window as something else slammed into it from the outside. The subtle whispers, the gentle tapping, they were gone. In their place was a chorus of rage. Deep guttural snarls echoed from beneath the floorboards. A high, piercing shriek tore through the air from the direction of the roof. The walls began to groan under the assault of dozens of heavy, rhythmic thuds, as if a crowd of giants was trying to beat its way in. The match went out. Arthur dropped it with a cry of shock, plunging us back into a darkness that was no longer empty. It was filled with the cacophony of a full-scale assault. He was hyperventilating, making small, terrified, gasping sounds. The man of logic had just been confronted with an impossible, violent response. He finally understood. The danger had never been my parents'. It was outside. It had always been outside. In the brief silence between the hammering blows against the house, his whisper was a pathetic, broken thing. What is that? What's out there?" I heard my father move to the window, to his familiar post, even under this unprecedented attack. His voice, when it came from the darkness, was flat and dead, a voice of grim certainty. "You invited them to dinner." The assault was relentless. The house, which had been my entire world and my only fortress, was groaning under the attack, its old bones threatening to splinter and break. The noise was a physical thing, a crushing weight that vibrated through the floorboards, up my legs and into the base of my skull. It was the sound of a world being torn apart. A heavy rhythmic scraping started directly above us, the sound of immense claws trying to tear through the shingles and plywood of the roof. The front door shuddered and cracked with each thunderous impact, the wood splintering audibly. Arthur was a wreck. He was huddled on the floor, his hands over his head, muttering to himself, "This isn't real, this isn't real, this isn't real." "What are they?" he finally screamed over the din, his voice cracking with terror. He looked at my father, his eyes pleading for an answer that could somehow make sense of this. "What do they want?" My father, standing grimly in the center of the room, had become the eye of the storm. His fear was still there, a palpable aura around him, but it had been calcined into a hard, brittle resolve. "They aren't alive," he shouted back, his voice rough and strained. "Not like us. They're old. They're tied to this land, to this place." A violent crash from the kitchen made us all jump. It sounded as if the window over the sink had been smashed in. This is a truce, my father continued, his voice rising in desperation, as if he could make the things outside hear him. The darkness is a contract. We stay unseen, we don't provoke them, and they let us be. A truce? That's not a truce out there, that's a war, Arthur shrieked. Because you broke the rule, my father roared, his voice finally breaking with a wave of grief and fury. The light, it's not just a beacon. To them, it's a signal, an invitation. It tells them someone in here has chosen to be seen. It's a breach of the pact, and they have to collect the price. The word hung in the air, more chilling than any of the sounds from outside. Collect. Suddenly, with a deafening screech of tortured metal, the main deadbolt on the front door gave way. The door flew inward an inch, held only by the latch. A sliver of impossible darkness was visible in the gap, and a low, guttural snarl slithered into the room, a sound that felt wet and ancient. That was the moment Arthur broke. His panicked muttering stopped. His rational mind, so useless against the supernatural, found a new, simpler imperative: escape. The house was a death trap. The outside was the unknown. He chose the unknown. "I'm getting out of here," he said, scrambling to his feet. "My car. I have to get to my car." "No!" my mother screamed, grabbing his arm. "You can't go out there. The house is the only thing keeping us alive. The house is falling apart," he yelled, shoving her away. "They're coming in. My car is my only chance." He was a man possessed by pure animal panic. He scrambled towards the splintering front door. My father tried to tackle him, but Arthur was wild with adrenaline, slipping past his grasp. He fumbled with the doorknob and the latch, his only thought to put the walls of this insane house behind him. The door is all that's holding them back. My father bellowed, "Arthur, for the love of God, don't!" His fingers found the latch. He turned it. The instant the mechanism clicked open, the door was ripped from its remaining hinge as if by a hurricane. It flew across the room, smashing into the far wall. Arthur was thrown back, stumbling into the door frame. For one horrifying, silent moment, he was perfectly silhouetted against the night. He opened his mouth, but his final scream was stolen from his lungs. From the featureless, absolute darkness of the doorway, things emerged. They weren't creatures of flesh and bone. They were tendrils of living shadow, impossibly long and thin. Whips of pure void that lashed out with silent speed. There were dozens of them. They wrapped around his arms, his legs, his torso. He didn't scream. He didn't fight. He simply came apart. It wasn't violent, not in the way of blood and gore. It was a terrifying silent dissolution. His form wavered, stretched, and was then pulled into the tendrils, absorbed into the deeper blackness from which they came. His substance, his very being, was unmade in an instant. A final choked gasp was the only sound. Then the tendrils of shadow snapped back out of sight, with a supernatural boom that shook the foundations. A new undamaged door slammed into the frame, or perhaps the old one was remade. A new lock clicked into place with a sound of chilling finality. And then silence. The assault was over. The scratching, the pounding, the shrieks, all gone. The house was plunged into a stillness so profound it felt louder than the chaos it replaced. The contract was satisfied. The price had been paid. We were left in the suffocating darkness, the three of us. My mother was sobbing quietly. My father was breathing in great shuddering gasps. I was just staring at the new unbroken door. The afterimage of Arthur's dissolution burned forever onto the backs of my eyes. The silence that we had once cultivated as our shield now felt like a tombstone. Nearly a decade passed. The ghost of Arthur, the man who dissolved in our doorway, had a permanent seat at our dinner table. His memory was a silent, suffocating presence that confirmed the stakes and sanctified our rules. In the wake of his horrific death, the house had sealed itself in amber. We did not change. We did not grow. We simply endured. I turned 17. My body grew. My voice deepened. But my world remained the four confining walls of our home and the small, sunlit patch of woods surrounding it. The fear I had known as a child, that sharp, primal terror, had not vanished. Instead, it had petrified, hardening over the years into something heavier and more complex. A deep, burning resentment. My parents had aged into ghosts of themselves. The light had gone out of my mother's eyes, replaced by a permanent, haunted vigilance. My father's silence grew, becoming a chasm that separated him from us, from the world. He was the stoic high priest of our dark religion, performing the Dusk ritual, with a mechanical piety that was devoid of all hope. They were no longer trying to live. They were simply managing the terms of their surrender, and I hated them for it. I hated the suffocating quiet, the joyless meals in the dark, the constant gnawing anxiety. I hated the prison they had built for me, for us. Through the crackle of an old battery-powered radio during the safe daylight hours, and from the pages of the few dog-eared books we owned, I pieced together a vision of the outside world. It was a world of streetlights and movie theaters, of crowded high schools and stupid teenage parties, of girls you could talk to and friends you could drive around with. A world of light and noise and life, a world that was a distant, impossible myth. To survive, my mind began to perform a necessary act of treason. I began to doubt. The memory of Arthur's end was seared into my brain, but I was a child when it happened. How reliable is the memory of a terrified 8-year-old in a pitch-black, chaotic room? My teenage mind, desperate for an escape hatch, began to construct a new narrative. Arthur had panicked. He'd run out into the dark. The things I thought I saw, the shadows, the tendrils, they were tricks of the light, projections of my own fear. He probably just got lost in the woods, fell and died of exposure. The creatures, the whispers, the tapping, they were the products of a shared psychosis, a folie à deux that had blossomed in the fertile soil of our profound isolation. My parents weren't guardians. They were sick, and their sickness was infecting me. This new belief became my secret gospel. It was the only thing that gave me hope, the only narrative that offered a future beyond these walls. Clinging to it, I began to plan. Our only connection to the outside world was an old, rust-eaten farm truck my father used for hauling wood and supplies on rare, carefully planned daylight trips into the nearest town, a place I was never allowed to go. That truck became the centerpiece of my obsession. I told my father I wanted to learn to drive, to help him with the wood pile. He taught me with a weary reluctance, showing me how to handle the stiff clutch and the wide, clumsy turning radius. For him, it was a chore. For me, each lesson was a rehearsal. I became a thief of the most precious resource on our property, gasoline. Siphoning a mouthful at a time from the main tank into a collection of old glass bottles, which I hid deep in the woods. I studied the worn-out road map in the glove compartment until its faded lines were etched onto my memory. A single red line led from our area to a town called Haven, and from there, a thick blue line designated a highway, a vein that could carry me into the living, breathing body of the world. My father, for all his haunted distraction, was not a fool. He found my cache of bottles one afternoon. He didn't yell. The time for that kind of energy had long since passed. He simply confronted me in the kitchen that evening, his face etched with a familiar, deep-seated sorrow. "There's nothing for you out there, Leo," he said, his voice quiet and heavy. "There's nothing for me in here," I countered, the bitterness I'd swallowed for years finally rising in my throat. "You don't understand what you're protected from," he said, his eyes pleading with me. "This life, it's the only thing that keeps you safe." "This isn't protection," I snarled, my voice low and shaking with a decade of repressed fury. "It's a cage, and I'd rather be dead than spend the rest of my life in here with your ghosts." He flinched as if I'd struck him. He had no answer for that. He simply turned and walked away, leaving me alone with my anger. That night, lying in the oppressive darkness of my room, I felt no fear. The faint, familiar sounds began outside the walls, the dry scratching I'd known my whole life. But they were no longer the sounds of monsters. They were the sounds of my prison bars. I had made my decision. I would not let their sickness, their fear, be the final word of my story. I would run. I would drive into the sunrise, and I would not stop until I found the world of light I had only ever dreamed of. I had to know once and for all if the monsters were real, or if they had been inside our heads all along. The final night in that house was the longest of my life. I did not sleep. I lay in the darkness, not as a prisoner, but as a runner on his blocks, waiting for the starting gun. When the quality of the silence outside shifted, the pre-dawn hush that signals the night's exhaustion, I moved. Every motion was one I had practiced in my mind 1,000 times. I moved through the familiar darkness of the house with a silent, fluid grace, my bare feet making no sound on the floorboards I knew so well. I did not allow myself to look into my parents' room as I passed. I could not afford a final pang of guilt or a moment of hesitation. I was a surgeon cutting away a diseased part of my life, and the cut had to be clean. The back door unlatched with a well-oiled click. The cold, damp air of the morning was a shock, a taste of a world beyond the stale, recycled fear of our home. I slung the backpack with my precious bottles of gasoline over my shoulder and made my way to the truck, a hulking shadow in the gloom. The hardest part was starting the engine. The sound of the old ignition grinding to life felt like a betrayal that ripped through the morning stillness, a roar that I was sure would wake my father and bring him running. I jammed the truck into gear, my hands trembling, and rolled down the driveway without headlights, navigating by the faint, gray memory of the world just before dawn. I drove for an hour, the truck rattling and groaning down the dirt road, plunging deeper into a world I'd only ever seen from my window. As I finally hit the paved two-lane road from the map, the horizon ahead of me began to bleed with color. A thin, pale line of lavender and rose appeared, outlining the dark, jagged shapes of the distant hills. I had to pull over. The truck shuddered to a stop on the gravel shoulder, and I just watched, my breath held tight in my chest. I had seen the sun before, of course, through the thick glass of our windows, a muted, distant star. But I had never been outside to greet it. I had never witnessed the birth of a day. It was a symphony. The colors deepened, from soft pastels to a brilliant fiery orange that set the undersides of the clouds ablaze. And then the first sliver of the sun itself crested the hill, and it was not just a light. It was a physical force. It was a wave of warmth and brilliance that washed over the landscape, chasing the long purple shadows back into the trees. It spilled over the dashboard onto my hands, and I lifted them, turning them over in the golden light as if seeing them for the first time. The light was not a weapon. It was not a traitor. It was a promise. It was the most beautiful, hopeful thing I had ever seen. I drove on, a stranger in a world that was suddenly, miraculously real. Every mundane detail was a revelation. Mailboxes at the ends of driveways, brightly colored road signs, other cars driven by people who were not hiding. I passed through the small town of Haven, and it was like landing on another planet. A gas station glowed with neon even in the morning sun. A woman walked a dog on a leash. Teenagers stood laughing outside a diner, their faces open and unafraid. The day was a blur of overwhelming sensory input. The noise of traffic, the smells from the diner, the sheer dazzling variety of colors. I was an alien, a ghost from a forgotten monochrome world, and I had just walked into a kaleidoscope. As the afternoon began to fade, the real test came. The old, deeply ingrained instincts began to scream. The light was thinning. The shadows were lengthening, a primal part of my brain, the part that had been conditioned for 18 years, urged me to find shelter, to lock the doors, to draw the curtains and prepare for the coming of the dark. I found a small park at the edge of town and forced myself to sit on a bench. My heart hammered. My palms were sweating. I was terrified, not of what might be in the dark, but of the darkness itself. It was the ancestral enemy I made myself watch. I watched the sun dip below the horizon, painting the sky in those familiar bruised colors. But here, they weren't a warning. They were just beautiful, and then it was gone. For a moment, there was a tense twilight quiet. I held my breath. A soft hum filled the air, and a streetlight above me flickered to life, casting a warm circular pool of orange light on the grass. A few seconds later, another one down the street came on. Car went by, its headlights cutting clean white beams through the dusk. Across the park, the windows of houses began to glow, one by one, squares of yellow and white in the deepening blue. The world did not fall silent. It did not hold its breath. It simply turned on its own lights. The sounds of the crickets started up, a cheerful, noisy chorus. Music drifted from an open window. A dog barked. I sat on that bench, bathed in the glow of the streetlight, and I began to laugh. A wild, choked, disbelieving laugh that turned into a sob. The fear, the weight, the 18 years of suffocating darkness, it all broke and washed away. I was right. I was right. It had all been a lie. Sitting in a world ablaze with light, surrounded by the casual, noisy business of life, I was finally completely safe. I was free. The first 3 months of my new life were a fever dream of liberation. I got a job washing dishes in the Haven Diner, a noisy, chaotic place that smelled of grease and coffee. I rented a small, one-room apartment above a hardware store. It was shabby and the plumbing rattled, but it was mine. Its greatest feature was the persistent, comforting hum of the old refrigerator, a sound I had been denied my entire life. Every night, I would fall asleep with the small lamp on my bedside table burning, a tiny, defiant sun against the darkness. I did not think of my parents. I did not think of the house. I walled off the first 18 years of my life behind a thick barrier of denial. It was a sickness, a shared delusion, and I had found the cure. The cure was light and noise and the simple, anonymous rhythm of a normal life. I was healed. I was free. The first crack in my new reality was so small I almost missed it. I was walking home from a late shift, the street slick with recent rain. The sodium streetlights cast a warm orange glow, reflecting beautifully on the wet pavement. As I passed under one of them, it flickered. It dimmed for a second, the circle of light at my feet shrinking before it returned to its full brightness. I barely registered it. A faulty bulb, a loose wire, nothing more. A week later, I was watching an old television in my apartment. When I turned it off, the screen went dark, becoming a black mirror reflecting the room. For a split second, the reflection was wrong. The shadow in the corner of the room behind my armchair seemed to stretch, to deepen into a blackness that was absolute. I blinked, and the reflection returned to normal. Just a faint, distorted image of my lamp and my chair. My heart gave a nervous little skip, a muscle memory of a fear I thought I had excised. The incidents grew like weeds pushing through the carefully laid pavement of my new life. One night, while wiping down the large front window of the diner, I saw it. Across the street, standing under a flickering streetlight, was a silhouette. It was exactly as I remembered from my childhood window. Unnaturally tall, impossibly thin, a shape made not of shadow, but of a tear in the fabric of the night itself. My rag froze against the glass. My blood ran cold. A bus rumbled past, its headlights momentarily blinding me. When it was gone, the silhouette was gone too. Just your mind playing tricks, Leo, I whispered to myself, my voice trembling. It was trauma, a phantom limb of a fear that had been amputated. It had to be. But then others began to notice. "Hey, Leo," my boss at the diner said one night, tapping a fluorescent light fixture above the dish pit that was buzzing erratically. "You notice the lights always seem to go haywire when you're closing. Must be something with the wiring." My upstairs neighbor stopped me in the hall. "Is it just me, or does this hallway light burn out like once a week? It's getting spooky." Each comment was a small, cold stone dropped into the pit of my stomach. I was the common denominator. The flickering lights, the strange feelings, the shadows that seemed to move when you weren't looking. It had all started when I arrived in Haven. The final horrifying revelation came on a Tuesday. I was in my apartment, the lamp on, the radio playing softly. The light above me flickered once, twice, then steadied. A sudden intense cold filled the room. A drop in temperature so profound, it felt as if the door had been thrown open to a winter storm. And with the cold came the silence. The familiar predatory stillness I had spent my entire life trying to escape. The radio went dead with a crackle of static. My heart hammered in my chest. I turned slowly to look at my own shadow, cast on the wall by the lamp behind me. It moved. I was standing perfectly still, but my shadow swayed, detaching itself from the laws of physics. It stretched, its limbs elongating into those grotesquely familiar, stick-like proportions. For one horrifying, eternal second, my shadow lifted itself from the floor, peeling away from my feet to become a two-dimensional version of the thing at the window. A freestanding silhouette of pure darkness. Then, just as quickly, it snapped back, becoming my normal, harmless shadow once more, and I knew. The pieces of the puzzle, pieces I had so desperately tried to ignore, slammed together with the force of a physical blow. The truth was not a delusion. It was a bloodline. The curse, the entity, the watchers, they were never tied to the house. They were tied to my family. My parents hadn't been hiding from the monsters in the woods. They had been containing the monster within themselves. Their ritual of darkness wasn't a shield. It was a cage, a way to keep the inherited shadow dormant, anchored, unseen. My escape, my triumphant race into the light, had not been a liberation. It had been a jailbreak. I had torn the curse from its anchor, from the only place it had ever been successfully contained. And I had brought it out into the bright, unsuspecting world. I sank to the floor, the comforting hum of my refrigerator now sounding like a mocking laugh. My freedom was the greatest lie of all. I hadn't escaped my prison. I had just made it infinitely bigger. My brightly lit apartment was not a sanctuary. It was a stage, and I was the star of the show, a walking beacon for the very thing I could never outrun. I did not move from the floor for a long time. The revelation did not come like a thunderclap. It settled like a layer of thick, cold ash, burying the vibrant, noisy world I had so desperately built. Every memory of my childhood replayed in my mind, but the lens had been changed. My parents' faces were no longer twisted by madness, but by a terrible, heroic resolve. Their constant fear was not for themselves, but for the consequences of a single mistake. The house was not a prison, it was a quarantine, and they were its willing, lifelong wardens. My resentment, the bitter fuel that had propelled me for a decade, evaporated, leaving behind a hollow, aching grief. I had called my father a jailer, when in fact he had been a shield, standing guard not just over his family, but over the fragile border between his world and the next. I hadn't escaped a cage. I had broken quarantine and unleashed a plague of shadows into a world that didn't even know it was sick. The flickering streetlights of Haven, the strange feelings my neighbors had, the figure I'd seen across the street. They weren't hunting me. They were manifesting through me. My presence, my life force, my simple act of existing in the light was an open doorway. I was a walking, breathing, haunted house. The anger and hatred I had felt for my father transformed into a profound, crushing understanding. He had not been trying to keep me from the world. He had been trying to keep the world from me. I finally stood up, my movements stiff and deliberate. There was no choice. To run again would be to carry this sickness to another town, to another brightly lit street. To ignore it would be to let it fester here, to let the shadows lengthen and deepen until they eventually consumed more than just a man in a doorway. There was only one solution, the one my parents had discovered a generation ago. The only method of containment that worked. I walked to my window. Below, the city of Haven was alive. Cars moved like fireflies. The diner sign glowed a cheerful red, and in the windows of other apartments I could see the blue flicker of televisions, the warm yellow of kitchen lights. It was a world of beautiful, oblivious energy, a world I had to protect. With a final, mournful look, I took hold of the cheap plastic blinds and pulled them shut. The slats clattered into place, plunging the room into a dim twilight. It wasn't enough. I went to the closet and pulled out a thick blanket, using thumbtacks to secure it over the entire window frame, sealing the last of the city's glow away. My heart was a slow, heavy drum in my chest. This was not a surrender. It was an acceptance. I began the patrol. My small lamp, my defiant sun, was the first to go. I didn't just turn it off. I reached behind the table and pulled the plug from the wall, the plastic prongs making a soft scraping sound. I moved to the television, its small red standby light a single, malevolent eye in the gloom. I unplugged it. The old humming refrigerator was next. I pulled it away from the wall, the accumulated dust of my free life stirring at my feet, and yanked its thick cord from the socket. The sudden silence was a shock. It was the absolute, profound stillness of my childhood. The death of the house. I moved through the small apartment, a ghost performing a sacred rite. The digital clock on the microwave was covered with a strip of black tape. The batteries were removed from the small radio on my counter. Every potential source of light, no matter how small, was neutralized. I was no longer Leo, the runaway. I was my father's son. When it was all done, I walked to the small metal fuse box by the door. My hand trembled as I lifted the cover. I looked at the black switches, the neat labels I had never bothered to read. With a deep, shuddering breath, I gripped the main breaker and pulled down. The world vanished. I was left in a perfect, absolute, and familiar darkness. Outside, I could hear the faint, distant sounds of Haven. A siren, the rumble of a truck, a burst of laughter. They were sounds from another world, a world I was no longer part of. I was an island of intentional night in an ocean of light. The old fear was gone. In its place was the grim, heavy weight of duty. I sat down on the floor, my back against the wall, and I began my watch. I was not a prisoner waiting for the warden to appear at the window. I was the warden, and I was waiting for the prisoner inside me to test the bars of its cage. The ritual was mine now. The darkness was my inheritance. And in the suffocating silence of my self-imposed prison, I finally understood the terrible peace my father must have known. This was the only way. This was my life now. This was the end of my story and the beginning of my watch.